All right. Good morning. We are with today. Today we're with Stephen Horne, an herbalist that I have followed for quite some time. But the reality is that I don't know a ton about Stephen's background. I know that he has probably one of the best newsletters in the herbal world that I look forward to getting every week or so whenever something comes out, and it's always a really great read. So, Stephen, thank you for being here today. And we got some really fun topics to dive into. But yeah, let's just start with kind of your history.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I've been involved pretty much full time in this business since the early 1980s. So that's like 40 years. But before that, what got me interested is I was actually studying outdoor survival. I actually put it this way. I was working on my nature merit badge to become an Eagle Scout. And I decided to study herbs and rocks and soils because I figured they wouldn't run away while you were trying to look up what they were in the book. And I became fascinated with edible and medicinal plants. So after about a year of just getting really into Native American lore and the whole kind of outdoor survival thing, I had a spiritual experience in which I had this profound kind of understanding that the Creator had placed all these remedies on earth for us to use. And they were here and they were free for everyone, and that I just needed to learn about it. So I spent a lot of my teen years when I was out hiking and camping and whatever with a field guide in hand, looking up plants and trying to learn botany. And it was so that hobby of mine merged with my communications background, and so I basically used my writing and speaking ability to, teach people about herbal remedies, and which I've been doing pretty much, like I said, full time since for the last 40 years. So,
wow, that's amazing. So, where are you located? I mean, obviously, you're kind of in some natural areas, from what it sounds like. Where was this taking place?
Well, I grew up in Salt Lake City, so it was in the mountains of northern Utah where I was learning all this stuff. And then I actually went to work for a major herb company for a few years and started an educational program for them. And then I went independent and began to do that. I also have been involved with the American Herbalist Guild. I was on their board for 4 years. I was president for 4 years. And I also have been involved with the International Iridology Practitioners Association. I've been on their board as well. And so I've been involved in this community trying to help promote natural healing in general. Because from a more personal point of view, I grew up with a lot of health problems. I had chronic sinus problems, and and with the medical treatments, they just seemed to get worse. At one point, the family doctor we had, which he was a good man, I'm not faulting him, but he put me on antibiotics for an entire year to get rid of my chronic sinus problems. And at the end of the year, my sinus problems were worse than when they started. And it wasn't until I started to actually try to apply some of this information I learned in my teens, changing my diet and trying some herbal remedies and going to a chiropractor, that I actually started to get feeling better. And then I started using this with my family, with my kids. And it was a little scary at first because, one thing to experiment on yourself, another thing when it's your children. But I actually found that I could get my kids well faster than I could by taking them to the doctor. So my kids grew up with pretty much never taking antibiotics or having any of those things, because I treated all their colds, earaches, sore throats, and everything with natural remedies. And I found they worked really, really well. And also my parents were elderly. I guess I hate to say that because I'm as old as my parents, older than my parents were when I started with this. But, they told me towards the end of their life that they were so grateful because all of their friends, their senior friends, were on at least 5 different drugs, and all of them seemed to be doing well. And they weren't taking drugs. They were taking herbs and nutritional supplements, and they felt like they were doing much better because of it. And so I really think that there's a lack of education about what natural remedies can do. And my personal belief is this: there are times when medicine is necessary, when modern medicine is necessary. But for most ordinary ailments, and also for most chronic ailments for which there is no effective treatment, the best thing to do is to start out with natural remedies. Change your diet, do some body work, get some exercise, take some herbs, take some nutritional supplements, experiment with things. They're not going to hurt you. They're not going to kill you. If you have a reaction to something because it just doesn't agree with your body, stop taking it and it goes away in a day or two. And you'll find that you probably will be better. And then if you do need to go to a doctor, go to a doctor. So.
Yeah, definitely. I recently was at a little small conference, and it was quite funny because it almost seemed like one of the speakers that it kind of eventually came across subtly as like one of the main reasons to have children is to have test subjects. And at the same time, I think that's actually, especially when working with children, that's like one of the biggest fear areas for most people, right? It's like, and you see this with fever phobia. No one knows how to work with fever anymore. It's just immediately, all alarms, freak out. We don't know what to do. Take them to the ER immediately type of mentality.
Yeah, it's like I see people and their child is running a fever of 101, and they're all concerned and they want to, give them something to bring down the fever. And I'm going, no. Look, a fever of 101 is just your immune system fighting the infection. It is actually, by elevating the temperature, it inhibits the replication of viruses, which allows your immune system to have some space to build up antibodies to fight the infection. So when you're doing these things to suppress the symptoms like the fever, you're actually interfering with what the body is trying to do to get well. And that was the biggest discovery I made, by the way, in terms of what altered my entire paradigm. It wasn't just using herbs. It was realizing that particularly in acute illness, the symptoms of coughing, sneezing, runny nose, fever, diarrhea, whatever, are all actually responses of the immune system to the infection. The infection isn't causing those symptoms. The immune system is causing those symptoms. And that what we needed to do was to support what the body was trying to do to fight the infection. So you got a fever, put your child in a warm bath, okay, to help the body with the warm temperature. And once you get the sweat glands open and the kid starts to perspire a little bit, the fever will break. Also, if you clear the bowel, the fever will break. And the medical doctor I referred to before, he was a distant relative on my family tree, Dr. Lyman Merrill Horne. He told my mom once, he said, people don't know home remedies anymore. He says, I've been out to see people who were sicker than when I was sicker than they were. And I think it's a big problem that most people just don't know any home remedies. And like you say, they're terrified of trying this stuff on their kids when it's really not that serious or dangerous. I mean, yeah, if you got a fever running up in 104 or 105, then, you've got an issue that you need to take care of, because then it starts to cause damage to the nervous system. But at 101, 100, even 102, it's nothing. It's just, and the runny nose isn't going to kill you. And none of that,
Yeah.
And so it's just symptomatic relief. And that's the main thing that we're offering in modern medicine is symptomatic relief. And that's true for chronic illness as well. It's basically just doing something to ease whatever the symptoms are. No one asks, like even with adult stuff, someone has high blood pressure. You put them on a medication to lower the blood pressure. The question you want to know is, why is the body elevating the blood pressure? What is obstructing circulation, and how do we help the circulation to be normal? And I can tell you right now, a couple of very common causes of moderate high blood pressure are stress, magnesium deficiency, dehydration, and there's also some emotional things associated with high blood pressure too, of just unresolved grief and emotional pain that's causing the person to just be closed down emotionally. And you fix those things and the blood pressure comes down automatically, and you don't need any medications. But that is permanently curing the person. And there's not as much money to be made in curing people as there is in treating people. Because if you're going to be on a high blood pressure medication for the rest of your life to try to manage your high blood pressure, that's very profitable.
Yeah, you got a new subscriber, a lifetime subscriber.
A lifetime subscriber. And then, like you said, like and I see it now that I'm older, the people who are like on 5 or 10 different drug medications at my age, I turned 70 in June. It's not making them well. Anytime I've seen someone like that, they're not healthy. Sometimes I see someone and maybe they're taking a little bit of a high blood pressure medication, but most of what they're doing is they're trying to eat right. They're trying to live a healthy life, and they're in much better shape than the people who are on a whole bunch of medications.
What are your thoughts on, because I think at some point this is going to finally rear its I'm not going to call it an ugly head, but its interesting head. Whereas as of right now, the vast majority of people, when they think about the issues with modern biomedical medicine, right? One is it's like the blame is put on the system and, the insurance companies, or it's put on typically capitalism. Whereas one thing that I've been trying to get people to understand is that actually it's not as simple as that. Because if you took the reductionist model, let's say that you just gave all the scientists the potential money that they might want to do their research, and you took out the manipulation of capitalism from the equation, my point to them is that those scientists would still use the same methodologies. It would still be symptomatic and reductionistic to a degree. What are your thoughts on that? Well,
yeah, because like I say, the biggest discovery I made was not just switching from, medical, pharmaceuticals to herbs and other natural remedies. It was a paradigm shift in understanding the difference between treating the effect and trying to identify and remove the cause. And unfortunately, when we talk about, there is this tendency to look at capitalism. I don't like the term capitalism because it's tied in to me with banking and loans and interest and all that. But free market, and as people freely trading goods and services. We don't have a free market healthcare system. We don't. It is heavily basically skewed towards that reductionistic medical model. If you go back a little over 100 years, there were a whole bunch of different kinds of physicians in the United States. There were homeopaths, there were naturopaths, the chiropractic movement was born. But the biggest movement was eclectics. And the eclectics were the most popular doctors in the late 1990s, early 1900s, up until around the time of 1920. And they said, we'll use whatever works. Herbs, homeopathy, drugs, surgery, whatever we find is of most benefit to the patient, we're going to do that. And they were the most popular school of medicine. So it was actually John D. Rockefeller, who didn't like competition, who didn't like the free market, who liked monopolies, who funded the Flexner Report to go out and say, oh, the situation in America of medicine is horrible, and we'll pump huge amounts of money into people who will only teach the use of pharmaceutical drugs. And they managed to create a negative legal environment for these other alternative practices. So one of the things I'm really big on is I would like to see a restoration of more free market principles in healthcare. Why should someone who is using non-toxic botanicals, for instance, or doing foot reflexology, okay, have to risk being charged with practicing medicine without a license when that is not, by definition, what modern medicine is, right? As long as they're not doing harm and they're not telling people not to go seek medical help, why not? In fact, there was a study done, and I think it was, I can't remember which state it was, where there was a case that came up, and they did a study and they found out that generally speaking, all this stuff was harmless. It never caused thing, and they actually created what was called a safe harbor bill, which basically, and these have been passed in a number of states, where you can, as long as you disclose your credentials and you don't claim, make wild claims about curing disease or whatever, you're free to do these things. But there's always this push from the pharmaceutical industry to, inhibit the information. I mean, I've lived through this, basically being told I cannot publish a book that lists a particular company's products, and that's not the FDA, that's the FTC. Okay, that I, as a third independent party, I'm not allowed to talk about some company's products without the threat of being sued.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
so I don't blame the free market principle for this. The competition or people being able to choose what they think is in their own best interest, but people think, oh, well, that's dangerous. Okay, but if iatrogenic disease is the sixth leading cause of death, then tell me how an enforced monopoly for pharmaceutical medicine is doing us is worse.
right. There's I think a very big underlying theme in our culture that most people aren't conscious of is that we've been infantilized as a culture.
Exactly.
Right?
We're not
treated
allowed
as
to be
infants.
adults. We're not allowed to be adults and make rational adult decisions. And the problem is that we put our trust in this idea that we're okay because this FDA or whatever is looking out for us. But all those agencies that are, quote unquote, looking out for us are all staffed by people from the industries they're policing. Okay, so how is that safe? In fact, it's just it's one of the problems that really basically is a big issue for me, because I have to be extremely careful about what I say, extremely careful about who I talk to, and et cetera. And I feel there's this constant desire to want to suppress people like me, and we especially saw it a few years ago, where anybody who tried to give any information about enhancing the immune system to help, reduce your risk of viral diseases or whatever was censored for quote unquote false information, even though all of that is extremely well documented in scientific literature. So,
Right.
so something here is really amiss with the way this system is working, because even our freedom to speak and put out information is suppressed. And it is an issue for me that I don't know. You can tell how passionate I am about this whole thing, but
yeah, no, I imagine. I mean, I think for people who are prominent in this space, who are releasing books and are, very much in the community as leaders, it must be extraordinarily difficult. I don't run into that myself as much because, I'm just, a community herbalist and with friends, family, and people in my real proximity. But if I was putting a mass amount of information out, then yeah, it's a very tricky landscape. And so I can imagine how, it's frustrating, right? Because it's deeper than, it just goes so deep, right? It really, all of this, even beyond education, is like this information was fundamental to culture throughout all of history, right? It was in all of our lineages, and that root has been severed, and we're trying to reclaim that root, but it's so suppressed, it's so frowned upon, and it's only allowed within a very narrow framework of what they say.
Yeah, right. And botanical medicine, like you say, is the foundation of medicine in general. I mean, it is the most ancient practice. It's been used in every culture in the world. And I tell people, you know why I'm an herbalist and not, into the pharmacology stuff? It's because which do you have more faith in? Anywhere from a couple of 100 to 2,000 years or more of human experience telling you that this thing has worked in real life with real people over and over again, or a 6-week double-blind study funded by a pharmaceutical company with a vested interest in the outcome, where half of those medications that are approved are taken off the marketplace within 5 years because they're found to have too many harmful side effects. Which one do you have more confidence in? I have more confidence in our rich tradition of herbal medicine. The first herb I learned to identify was yarrow. And I read, that yarrow was used to, stop bleeding. Well, interestingly, that is a Western tradition, but Native Americans used it for that purpose, and so did the Chinese. 3 different continents, 3 different groups of people for over 2,000 years have used yarrow to staunch wounds, to help heal battle wounds. And so when I was a teenager and I was out and I got injured when I was out with a bunch of kids as a YMCA camp counselor, and I had this gash in my elbow that was bleeding, and I realized I don't have any Band-Aids or any first aid kit. I was lying on the ground, I looked over, and there's the yarrow leaves, and I thought, well, this is as good a time as any to try this. Crushed them up, put them in the wound. By the time I got back to the main camp and went to see the nurse, she goes, well, that cut's not bad. There's nothing. And I had, so you have all this experience that people are sharing with you, and then you try it and it works. What is so controversial about that?
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting, right? Is a lot of, I personally, I'm trying to slowly move some of my community away from the idea of, like, I personally don't think it's actually a big conspiracy. I think a lot of times we want to go in that direction, and there is components of that. There's no doubt. I mean, we would be fools to not see that. There's always power dynamics. But really what this boils down to, from what I'm understanding, is that it really comes down to worldview and the understanding that there are different ways of deriving knowledge or knowingness or information about the natural world. And all these other ways, all these other ancient sciences, or just the fact of passing down a tradition for 10,000 years that shows with direct experience, hey, this plant works for this thing. Our ancestors wouldn't have used it if it wasn't working, right? And that way of knowing is not allowed in the current modern framework is reductionist science only type of mentality. And that's only one way of knowing. And actually the other part of the funny part is it's multifold, right? It's like, not only is it not smart to only look at one way of knowing, but this way of knowing that we're working with is actually also just generally not the best way of knowing anyhow. So you wouldn't want to use it only, you know what I mean? But like, it's not to say, like, I'm not anti-science, but I'm definitely, I guess, I'd like to not be anti anything, but I'm very much questioning of reductionism and materialism in general.
Well, I am too. And it's not that, like you said, I appreciate when there are studies showing that, like, cinnamon helps to lower blood sugar or this or that or whatever. It's useful, but there's a number of herbs that lower blood sugar, but cinnamon is a spicy, warming botanical with an astringent quality to it. Whereas nopal, which has also been shown to lower blood sugar, is a mucilaginous, cooling, soothing. So the question is, and this is where reductionist science fails, is which one is more appropriate in working with this person, right? Because the only thing they're asking is, does it lower blood sugar? But they're not looking at the bigger picture of what else is going on. And as for the way of knowing, I have a very interesting story about that. Dr. Jerry McLaughlin was screening for cancer, anti-cancer chemicals. And the most powerful ones he found were the acetogenins from the American pawpaw tree. They were highly effective at destroying cancer cells with very low toxicity. And he was trying to get it as approved as a pharmaceutical drug, but was getting blocked. But he checked all the parts of the tree at different times of the year, and he found out that the cetogens were highest in the twigs in the spring, the unripe fruits in the summer, and the mature seeds in the fall. So I was doing a presentation for the American Herbalist Guild on his research about pawpaw, and some people said, well, how do you use the actual herb? Because I was talking about the standardized extract he was making. And I said, I don't know. And then finally, this one lady at the back says, if you'll turn off the microphone and stop the recording, I'll tell you. She was a Native American. Okay? Now get this. Her tribe had been using pawpaw to treat cancer for hundreds and hundreds of years. Okay. They gathered this is what she said to me. They gathered the twigs pointing towards Sky Father at the first full moon after the spring solstice. They gathered the unripe fruit at the summer solstice, and they gathered the seeds from the fruits that had been gifted to Mother Earth. In other words, had fallen to the ground in the fall. So they knew exactly which plant parts to use. They extracted them by fermentation. They're fat-soluble compounds. You can't get them in water. Okay? And they had been using them to treat cancer. Now, Dr. McLaughlin spent 10 years to find that information of which plant parts were highest, the fact that you had to extract it certain ways to get it out. They knew it. How did they know it? Do you think that they did this by trial and error, like for hundreds and hundreds of years of experiment? If you talk to all Native people, you know what they'll tell you. The plants told us. And in modern society, that has become to sound like those people are crazy. But they couldn't be crazy, because look at the accuracy of the information they got and that they were able to use. And I said to her, I went to lunch with her afterwards. I said, I can understand why maybe your people were reluctant to share some of this information with us, because we didn't treat you very nice. She says, natives killed white people killed natives. That has nothing to do with it. She says it's because white people won't follow directions. We tell them how to prepare it. We tell them the dose to use, and they would think if little is good, more is better. They'd hurt themselves and come back and blame us.
Yeah.
And it's because we've lost this respect for traditional wisdom. We don't even, we automatically discount it. And it's basically, there's a mindset in our culture that only reductionistic science is a path to knowledge, and that all the old stuff, all those people back then were stupid. And they weren't stupid. They weren't stupid.
It's so interesting, because I think that's also the biggest illusion that we're living under. And it's interesting because the first word that I always want to use when describing that is myth. But I do not use the word myth anymore, because myth is most often real. Myth is typically what is holding a lot of this ancient knowledge. And in the stories, it's talking about the plants and the animals and the cosmos and the rhythms and cycles. So I don't like to use the word myth in a derogatory sense, but one of the biggest illusions of modern culture is that all these previous cultures were just completely ignorant. I actually have a new theory, and we don't have to go into this, but I have my latest theory is that, and because I live down here in Peru in the Sacred Valley, right? So
wow.
It's quite a eclectic community, right? So there's lots of, not lots, but there's no one is gonna look at you funny if someone's talking about aliens or other things like that, right? Like no one frets over those things. But my latest theory is that I'm not opposed to the idea of there being aliens at all, but my main thing is that I actually think most likely there wasn't. And the main reason that I think that now is because the main reason most people think that aliens existed in ancient times is based on the premise that all of our ancestors were extraordinarily dumb and could not build the things that we find that we think are amazing, and therefore they must be alien.
I would say that's a pretty good way of explaining it, because like I said, I think we're suffering from that delusion that all the ancient people didn't know anything, and that only we in modern society with our technology are intelligent. And yet I will give this thing. So take the average person in modern society, strip away their electricity, their central heating, their central air conditioning, and throw them out in the woods, and how many of them could survive?
It's going to be less than 1%.
It is, because we have all this theoretical knowledge and all this dependent on technology. And I had a technical writing instructor said, do you want to know how much you are the master or the slave of technology? How much of it could you recreate if you were thrown onto a desert island?
Right.
You know, we're dependent on our technology. And that was one of the other things that I had when I was a teenager, was like, I had this vision of the electrical grid collapsing and what that did to modern medicine. You know,
Yeah.
and when you suddenly have no pharmaceutical drugs, you don't have X-ray machines, MRIs, all these other things. What are you going to do? And so and even if you have like a natural disaster where the power is shut off and you're kind of isolated from society for a couple of weeks, what do you do? I mean, we're very dependent on technology. We've lost our touch with nature, and we are part of nature. We are interconnected. This is a fundamental idea from traditional wisdom. We are a part of all we see. You know, we're not superior to the plants and animals and all this stuff, but we're part of it. And they didn't have a hard time using the herbs or using the resources of nature, but they used them according to need, not according to greed. And they were grateful for what they got. They were appreciative of the plants and the animals for providing them with the things they needed to survive. And this is something about the native cultures that I really resonate with, and I wish that we would be more grateful, more humble, more willing to be open and not so arrogant with thinking we're so smart and everybody else was so stupid.
Yeah, I was just telling, I couldn't agree more. I was just telling a friend the other day, I said, you know, what's interesting? I said, you look at all these cities that are now, like, I mean, we're just getting ready to enter into like the water crisis. I mean, this is going to be a massive thing over the next 20 years. A lot of people don't see coming, all across the world in different places. But I was recently in Mexico City, already big issues. There's massive issues in Bangalore and different places around the world. And I was just saying, I said, you know, do you think if we worshiped that water, we would be in these situations? If you were in a deep connection of reverence for water, would we be seeing these situations? And the answer is most likely no, right? It's because there's not a deeper spiritual relationship with these fundamental other, you know, whether you want to call them beings, spirits, or just
energies, whatever you want to call them.
The elementals, the fact that we are not in a harmonious relationship with them, it's leading to what we're seeing in the world today. And it's interesting because so many climate solutions are based on, again, trying to use technology to just override nature, right? We're going to strong arm it, which is what a lot of our technology tries to do, versus realizing the premium is on connection and the principle of harmony. Right, moving more toward that, but that sounds way too fluffy for a lot of people. But they don't realize that once the intention and the energy is pointed towards something of developing harmony, that all of the actions and behaviors that cascade down from that are the ones that will produce a world that is growing again with life and health. You know.
Yeah, well, the mindset that we have is one of, reductionism by nature is separating, right? It is not wholeness. One of the reasons why I like teaching energetics is because it's helping you see the bigger picture of how things are interconnected, not just how they're separate, but how they're interconnected. And we're not going to change the world by using governmental force or any of these kind of tools that we have. It has to happen within human beings, with them waking up and realizing that we need to change from the inside. So one of the things I was going to mention earlier is the reductionist medical system is not just the fault of the system. It's the fault of also of all the people who are consumers of it, who have adopted the idea that there's some quick fix. That if I've got a problem, I don't have to look at myself. I don't have to ask myself, am I taking care of my body? Am I eating healthy? Am I living, in harmonious relationship with the people around me? They don't have to question, what am I doing that's bringing this on? They just go and give me a pill to fix this, right? Give me the pill that's going to fix this. And you had talked about wanting to discuss antibiotics. And this is a good segue into that, because there's no question that antibiotics were a great discovery and have saved many lives. But the antibiotics, this idea that I can just go and get a pill and take care of this problem, is ignoring the other side of this picture, which is the biological terrain theory of disease, which is that in order for germs to invade the body, it has to first be weakened or damaged. And you can see that just the fact that if you get dirt or mud or whatever on your skin, right, you don't get an infection. You just wash it off. But if you get a cut and you get manure in there and dirty gooey gunk in there, right? It's going to get infected because there's a damaged area through which the infection can enter, right? Well, the same thing's true with, getting a cold or anything else. There has to be something that has reduced your resistance in order to have that happen. Stress, poor diet. I mean, if you look at the work of Weston Price when he went to 6 of the 7 continents in the 1930s and found the indigenous people living on traditional diets were rarely sick. They didn't suffer from the contagious diseases that their quote unquote civilized neighbors did. Why? Because they were naturally immune. They were eating healthy. They were living in harmony with each other. They were living in harmony with nature. They were healthy. The average person today is not healthy. They're living on a diet of junk food. They don't have harmonious, happy relationships with the people around them. They're not living in community like people always did. They're not living a healthy life. And they're just looking for the Band-Aid, the magic bullet, as we call it, that will absolve me of this. So we wind up overusing antibiotics to treat things like viral infections and fungal infections, for which they do absolutely no good. And the problem arises like this. Since the focus is on killing germs, right? You're never going to kill all the germs. And the ones that survive are going to be the ones that what? Were the most... that we're able to most adapt to the antibiotic, right? And this happens in agriculture too. In this book I read, Empty Harvest, we're using tons more insecticides than we were at the end of World War II, and we're losing twice the amount of crop damage to it. Why? Because every time you spray a field with insecticides, you're not only killing the insects, you're killing all the beneficial insects that kill the insects, and you're completely disrupting the harmony of nature. And the insects that survive are the ones that are most biologically adapted to the insecticide you're using. So what happens over time is you're breeding insecticide-resistant bugs, and you just are perpetuating the problem. And it's the same thing with antibiotics. When you're using antibiotics where they're not really needed, you're breeding antibiotic-resistant bacteria, which is a big problem. Modern medicine recognizes this as a problem, okay? But, the most colds, sore throat, sinus infections, bronchitis, ear infections, and respiratory infections are viral. Mm. So when you take the antibiotic, when the antibiotic is being given, and a lot of medical doctors know this as a placebo, right? Because the person wants it.
Right.
But in the meanwhile, then when antibiotics are needed for something that you really could use an antibiotic for, they're becoming less effective.
Right. Could we take a second before we go more into this? Because I don't think a lot of people have heard kind of the classic story of like germ versus terrain theory. Could you tell us a little bit? I mean, because this was like kind of a major, battle at some point in the development of medicine.
Yeah, when the microscope was invented and germs were first discovered, there were two schools of thought. The one school of thought, which was the Pasteur model that we all have grown up with, is that the tissues, the bacteria or infectious organisms were there, and they were the cause of the tissue damage. The other theory is the tissue damage created a breeding ground for the microbes. In other words, that the damage to the tissues preceded the infection, and that the microbes were there as scavengers. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's probably a little interplay between those two things, because, for example, if we take food poisoning, okay, the bacteria that cause food poisoning, they release a toxic chemical as they're feeding. So if they're multiplying in a food, this toxic chemical is in the food, and when you ingest it, that toxic chemical damages your intestinal lining, which creates a breeding ground for the infection, right? And then you have this problem of food poisoning. So because microbes release toxins, if you get a big enough dose of them, yeah, they could overpower your body's innate defenses. So obviously sanitation and cleanliness and not eating spoiled food or keeping wounds clean and all that is important. But the biological train part of it says that it's equally important, if not more important, that I take care of a healthy body, because normally we're surrounded by a sea of microbes that we cannot kill all of them. They're everywhere. Or we'd want to, because they are part of the ecosystem. And so and normally they're not affecting us negatively at all. In fact, we need to be exposed to them in order to develop the immune system to respond appropriately with them. So part of this is the research that shows that if children are raised on farms where they're playing with animals and they're out in the dirt, they have healthier immune systems than kids that are being raised in sterile homes where everything is disinfected. And so the kids who are raised in the sterile homes are more prone to allergies and autoimmune disorders, because the immune system does not know how to deal with ordinary background microbes. Mm-hmm. It overreacts to everything. So I am of the opinion that childhood diseases actually, properly dealt with, train the immune system on how to fight disease. Mm-hmm. And that we need some exposure to germs, and we need to get a runny nose when we're a little kid. And you support the kid in getting over it, and the kid's immune system is trained how to deal with this stuff. And I know that's probably a very controversial idea for a lot of people, but I know there are a lot of people who share that with me. But the fact is that we've overdone it with the fear of the microbes and the idea of keeping things clean and sterile.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's like too far the other direction. Cleanliness is important, sanitation is important, all those things are important, that's good. But in doing that, we've totally ignored the need to take good care of our immune system. And when I decided, with raising my kids, I wanted to focus on building their immune system. So I tried to study everything that I could about how the immune system worked. And so in addition to feeding them good food, one of the things I came to the conclusion on is that loving relationships build immunity. So I was always hugging my kids, always, being positive with them, always giving them, love and affection, not, harshly. I disciplined them, but not harshly, scolding them or, being angry with them. And I think that was part of what made them have a good immune system. It's not just about the physical part. It's also about the mental, emotional, and spiritual part of our being. Every time I have caught a cold, I've been under a lot of stress. And we know that stress lowers the immune system. So it's a holistic picture that we need to look at. And part of what needs to happen is more people have to be educated, get this message, because it takes enough people on the grassroots to start changing the system.
Right. It's an individual endeavor. At the end of the day,
it is. Yes.
It's an individual endeavor. I couldn't agree more. And yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, I like I think Matthew Woods talks about it, right? Of like the big, well, it wouldn't be elephant in the room, but the big idea of herbalism is that we actually believe in curing, the potential of curing. Whereas with biomedical medicine, actually, they themselves explicitly state that they cannot cure, right? That it's, well, you have a broken part and we're just going to have to replace it with whatever this thing is, or we're going to block this thing, or we're going to force this thing to, or we're going to give you a fake hormone, a synthetic hormone. But this isn't me putting words in their mouth. They would actually, you can read this, right? This is an underlying philosophic principle of biomedical medicine that they actually release any beginning to claim that thing. And I think that's interesting because one thing is even though that's their stance, that nothing is curable, it's interesting that in people's minds, medicine still lives as this idea that they're going to get cured using that medicine, which is fascinating in its own way. It's this cognitive dissonance that exists unconsciously in a lot of ways. But I also think, if there's the beauty of herbal medicine is I really like acute conditions because it shows you the power and the activeness of the plant. Just so, like, I love diarrhea. You know what I mean? Like, there's nothing better when a friend calls me and they have food poisoning or diarrhea or whatever, because they'll always message me back within 3 or 4 hours. And they're like, dude, I don't know what that plant does, but like, oh my God, like this thing is totally stopped now, or I'm feeling better. And so I love it because of those situations. But I also am continually trying to get people to this idea, and even myself for a long time, that when I get sick, I'm not looking to a plant or something to cure that sickness. All I'm looking for is, how do I support this thing? How do I support this physical body and the immune response as best I can? And every time I do that with people, they go, I'm normally sick for 10, 12, 14, 20 days. It's dragging on and on and on. Whereas when they hop into a hot bath, when they have a fever, or they wrap up in a bunch of blankets and put a hot pad in there, and they're keeping their body warm, and maybe they're taking a couple of plants as well, they're like, I feel amazing after 2 or 3 days of some rest. And so to me, that's the name of the game, right? It's like, look, you could be sick for 10, 15, 20 days with the current way, or you could be sick for 2 or 3. You're still going to get sick, right? I'm not trying to tell you that plants are going to make it to where you never get sick again, right?
Right.
But we can dramatically shorten it. And then I'd like to know your thoughts on this. One of my theories, of the many loose theories that I hold, is that because of the way we're approaching sickness, because people are getting a fever, suppressing it with ibuprofen or some NSAID or whatever, even an ice pack, when it's a fever that's not so high, they need an ice pack where they should let it run more, is that something is happening long-term there, right? Where now you have someone who for 15, 20, 30 years has continually suppressed the immune system's response. One of my theories is that that is most definitely a part of the equation of autoimmune, as well as
a lot of chronic illness. I absolutely believe that. In fact, what you're talking about again is what I was explaining earlier. The major paradigm shift for me was not chemicals versus plants. It was the idea of understanding symptoms as the effort of the body to either heal itself or maintain biochemical balance in the face of a challenge. That the symptoms were not the enemy. And what I needed to do was figure out what the body needed to support its healing process. That the healing comes from the body. You know, no doctor can heal a cut, but the cuts heal themselves all the time, right? And as long as you have the nutrients you need the body will do that, right? So when I switched to the exact kind of thinking you're talking about, that's when I started to get good results. When I stopped thinking in terms of relieving symptoms equaled cure.
Right.
Cure is restoring the body to balance so that it functions the way it normally does, helping the body get back to a state of balance. Yeah, right. Go ahead.
And I think it's interesting too, because herbalism also has that other factor, right? Where it's like one of my teachers will say that there is no person that could ever come to you seeking help for whether it's physical, mental, or emotional, where you won't have something to give them, right? Because that's what we're holding, like as herbalists and with all these different traditions. Whereas this is the big issue for the doctors, right? Because when the person comes demanding an antibiotic and they send them home, this happened recently. My niece had hand, foot, mouth disease, right? Which seems extremely uncomfortable. And they have no way of working with that. But again, even then, herbalism works at the symptomatic level, right? As soon as my sister told me, I said, okay, look, I can't just wipe this thing away in 1 second, but we can ease her symptoms in a way that isn't suppressing the symptoms, right? So we can get some aloe vera ice cubes for the blisters in her mouth, right? And then I think I gave her, she'd been refusing to eat for about 3 days because her throat was so swollen and blistered in her mouth, and, gave her the aloe vera ice cubes to swish around, as well as I think we gave her some yarrow and elderflower to work in that area. And my sister messages me, she's like, she wants to eat, within like 3 hours, she wanted to eat all of a sudden. And so even then, it's this beautiful thing with herbalism that you can work with symptoms and ease them, right? Like we may give someone some cramp bark when they do have this horrible stomach diarrhea type of thing going. I'm going to give them cramp bark, not because it's going to necessarily kill the bug or stop the diarrhea. I just want to help you with the cramps really quick, right? If I can just make you feel a little better with the cramps, and then I'll give you another plant for the diarrhea or whatever when the time is appropriate. But doctors don't have anything to offer people on these things, right? They don't have something of, hey, yeah, go home, here's some, try aloe vera, try this, try that, to just make it an easier process, which is something that I also just love about herbalism.
Yeah. Well, it often works very fast. I mean, not always, but it often works very fast. You start to feel better because you're just working with, I mean, like, okay, the aloe vera is antiviral. Aloe vera is soothing. And, as far as I can see, mucilaginous herbs cool down the excess irritation or heat in the tissues and probably help to absorb some of the irritating substances that are present in the tissues. So that, helps cool it down and everything. So it is working on both the underlying causes and the symptomology at the same time, because it's not a magic bullet, because plants contain thousands of chemical compounds that act on the body in very complex, interesting ways. Whereas all pharmaceutical medicine is based on isolated chemical compounds. And you don't find isolated chemical compounds in nature.
Exactly.
Even when it comes to botanicals that are drugs, that have a drug-like component to them, there's still vitamins, minerals, and other accessory factors in there that seem to have some kind of healing quality as well as the symptom relieving quality. I mean, I'm talking about something like lily of the valley, which I've used with, cardiac problems. And it's mildly toxic, but to me, it seems to do a better job of regulating the heart rate and helping it get back to normal than, say, digitalis does. So I really think that, like you say, the reductionistic mindset of we have to isolate it down to some specific active chemical is part of the problem. Like I have a formula. There's a formula that I get from a company, and I actually helped that company get that formula. It was a Dr. Wenwei Qi from China, and he had developed a formula to treat herpes, an herbal formula. It also seems to work against shingles as well. And he came over the United States, and there was a university did 2 years of research on this. And it did actually get rid of herpes. But when they took it apart to try to find the chemicals that they could patent as drugs, they couldn't find any. So they said, we're sorry, we're not interested in herbal formulas. We're only interested in patented drugs. And they just said, bye. So he had gotten to know an herbalist that was working with that company who contacted me, and we managed to get that formula, into that company. And it works on that and shingles very, very well. But why? Okay. People are like, why does it work? This whole idea that we have to scientifically, rationally explain it, that we can't just accept the fact that it works. Well, I really don't know how this thing works, but I use it, right? I use it all the time. I have no idea. I couldn't build one if I tried. And an herb is like that. It's a tool that has all this complexity to it, and I don't have to try to understand everything about why it works. I just have to understand that it does this, and then see when is it appropriate to do that? That's herbalism.
Yeah,
that's
yeah. It's I love those studies, especially when you take the studies of the complex Chinese formulas.
Yes.
And they'll do a study with, it's 8 different plants combined, which is probably, 2,000 or 3,000 or more different constituents by the time you were to add them all up together.
Right.
And then they'll try it with just each individual plant, and they'll be like, oh, that it's not coming out the same. It only comes out in this formula. And it's like, yes, that's the point, is that they figured out how all these plants work together to create the desired effect, and that it may not be just one of the plants or even one constituent. But I love those pieces of research because it shows the point.
Yeah, it shows the point that there is a place for reductionistic reasoning, and there's also a place for empirical, which is experiential based learning, and that the two can be used together. You don't have to have one or the other. You can use both, and I think it's like, the metaphor of the right and left brain, which isn't as perfectly the thing as sometimes people make it out to be, but it is two sides of our consciousness that we do better when we use both. When we engage our rational mind and our intuitive, creative mind together, we get better results. And also, this is true in human society. We have all these different people with all these different personalities and whatnot. And when we learn to cooperate and work together, all those differences make for a better society, because we need a whole bunch of different people, with different talents, different abilities, different things. I don't know why I'm going down this tangent, but I see that what I understand about the human body and health is a metaphor for humanity and society and the planet, because we are composed of all these individual little cells that have all differentiated and performing different functions. And as long as all those cells are doing what they're supposed to do, we're healthy. And there are many, many different kinds, many, many different functions. And as long as they're working harmoniously together, we're good. Well, it's just like society. We have all these different people fulfilling all these different roles. And when we have this uppity attitude of we're better than other people and this or that or that. I mean, I've seen people who are like look down their noses at people who do things like plumbers and electricians and how can you? What would we do without these people, without auto repair people and all these different things? We need this diversity of interests and occupations, and we need to live in harmony, like the health of the body has to live in harmony. And I think that's why me studying holistic health has made me a better person and made me a person who is more easily able to get along with a wide variety of people, because of that intuitive knowledge that comes as you start to absorb this traditional wisdom about health.
So, yeah. So
that went far afield.
No, but I mean, all of this, I think, leads well, because a lot of times these conversations, they zoom in immediately too much into the topic and the data and all these things, and we're right back in that reductionist, kind of conversation again, without really, hovering around this thing. And so let's go into, earlier you mentioned the eclectics, which is this group of doctors in, I think you said, like the late 1900s, right? Or the
late 1900s, early 20th century, yeah.
Early 20th century, right? And
like 1890 to 1920, yeah.
Okay.
And they were,
right.
Yeah.
And they were of the mindset of, we'll use whatever works. And in herbalism, if you start to, you being a leader in this community know this very well, but there's many different paths that one can enter or discover as they go, right? I mean, you could completely learn about plants from the Western biomedical view and only use them according to whatever research has been done on whatever plant, or you may come from more of the folk tradition of, ancient Greece or ancient Europe or Native American traditions or South America and indigenous medicines,
or Chinese or Ayurveda,
Chinese or Ayurveda, yeah, the big ones. And so there's so many paths here, and a lot of us, I think, as North American herbalists, as modern North American herbalists, it's definitely this big melting pot that we take. And so how would you describe your practice and how you approach it?
Yeah, well, I've borrowed from all of them. I because I think it's very interesting to see things from different points of view. Um, I mean, I started off with kind of Western herbalism, kind of Utah-based herbalism, which was Thompsonian in nature. I don't know if you know about Samuel Thompson, who you know was basically the early pioneer herbalist who published New Guide to Health, and it was when I encountered his book and his material, and that I had my first paradigm shift. And my second big paradigm shift was when the company I was working for created a line of Chinese herbal formulas. And I learned a lot of very interesting things about the Chinese system, yin yang, the 5 elements, all these different things. And that added another layer of meaning to it. And that made me interested in all of them. So then I dabbled in Ayurveda, I dabbled in this, I dabbled in that. And my big thing was trying to figure out how all this fit together. And so that's where I finally came up with the energetic models that I use, like my herb wheel and my aromatherapy wheel and everything, is that I started to understand there were these patterns, that underlie these things, and became just very fascinated with it. But honestly, I have a very eclectic attitude about the entire thing. If a person feels like they need orthodox medicine, okay, go do it. Because I feel like people need to try what they have a belief in, because if you try to force them to accept something that they don't really trust, you're psychologically working against their best ability. But if people are open to it, I'll steer them towards, natural remedies. I see people who do a little combination of both or whatever, and I'm okay with any of it. When I actually am working with someone, I'm often really trying to get them to get in touch with what they know. I've had parents call me about their kids and they're talking, and I said, well, what do you think? And they'll tell me, well, my feeling is that it's this. And I say, let's go with that. And you know what? It always works. And I want to get people to start trusting themselves.
Yeah.
That you have an inner knowing, an inner intuitive knowing about things. And if you learn to hone that, it can actually really guide you. And so there are times when I felt like a particular condition required medical care, and I've gone, in for medical care with something. And there are other times when I felt like, okay, we can handle this herbally. And a lot of it has to do with just being prayerful, intuitive, and really believing that there are answers. And
yeah.
So I had a son who had undescended testicles. And so I asked our midwife about it, and she said she talked privately to the medical doctor, and he said, well, they say that you have to have surgery. And I go, okay. So I got to thinking about this child, and I got thinking about kind of meditating on what I should do about it. And I felt like he was kind of a quiet, reserved child, and he was often overlooked by everybody else in the family. So we gathered together, we all prayed for him, and I felt impressed to give him a very low dose of ginseng, like 5 drops a couple of times a day. 2 weeks later, testicles descended. Okay, so I don't know how that happens. I don't know whether it's herb. I don't know whether it was just the prayer we all said. I don't know. But I've had so many experiences like that. And I think that people need to just be willing to give herbs a chance.
Mm-hmm. And prayer.
And prayer.
We've lost a lot of, I think that's, it's interesting. I studied religion in college, and primarily Eastern religion, but it wasn't until herbalism that it really brought me back to prayer, you know, and working. And a lot of people have prayer wounds, right?
Right.
If you were suppressed by a Catholic family or, you know, some sort of monotheism and these types of religions, oftentimes people become agnostic or atheist, and then and they lose prayer, and losing out on the fact that prayer is also one of our greatest technologies, right? It's an inbuilt technology that we have, along with cooking and working with plants. These are all probably the most sophisticated human technologies we actually ever will have.
Yeah. And it's this idea that I think that irregardless of your particular religious beliefs, that we all have access to a higher power, a higher consciousness. I don't care what you call it. Call it God, call it the universe, call it higher consciousness. But I believe people have access to that. And if they, you know, seek for answers, I think they'll find them.
Hmm.
And so I tell people I don't believe in incurable diseases. I only believe in incurable people.
Wow, I have not heard that one. I like that one. That is a very good one.
And it's because I think that a lot of people are not willing to really look for answers. They've bought into the idea that my condition is incurable. There's nothing I can do about it. And once you believe that, it's true. Because you're never going to look for answers, and even if you're presented with answers, you're not going to even try.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I figure there's always hope, and that there are answers out there, even if I don't know all of them. And I'm willing to search for them, and I'm willing to work with people to help search for them. You know, and that's why in my book, Strategies for Health, the strategy number 1 is believe you can get well.
Yeah, super important. And I also think it's, the herbalist has a very interesting role, right? Because it's holistic, which means, you know, you may give someone a plant for just the mental emotional aspect of the disease they're dealing with, right? And just the fact that, hey, this is leading me to depression or anxiety, and it's like, okay, well, we're going to give you this plant. This plant is not going to go for that disease. This plant is going for the emotional, you know, feedback loop that's being created through having this. And I think that that's, you know, one thing I'm learning as a young herbalist is that I'm finding a lot of people who are hyper obsessed with finding a cure, and that in itself is its own psychological challenge to work with, to help people kind of relax into healing and to not have this frantic approach to it. And so it's interesting, all the different ways in which, you know, we have to be like, yes, we believe in a cure, but let's not pursue it in a way where we're just grabbing at everything.
Where you're stressing yourself out and trying just everything and anything. That's a very, very good point. But the point you also just made is, isn't it interesting that plants do work on the mental and emotional, spiritual side of our being? I find absolutely fascinating, is that a plant can help change a person's mindset and belief system. How does that work? What is this whole thing is just such a amazing, I don't know, awesome mystery to me, about, just leaves me in awe, you know, because I've seen that happen.
Mm-hmm. You have any good stories about that?
Oh yeah, I have, because I use flower essences, and I do emotional healing. I do emotional healing work, and I was doing. This is one of the most. I have a lot of bizarre stories about this, but this is one that sticks in my mind about plants. You obviously know Matthew Wood and 7 Herbs Plants as teachers, right? And how he talks about the Easter lily, right? As purifying to the female reproductive organs, helping to resolve this dispute between sexuality and purity, right? And feeling unclean. So I was working with someone, and she dropped into the memories of being sexually abused. And she curled up in the fetal position with her hands down over her uterus, area, just in agonizing pain. And I didn't have any of my flower remedies with me. So I thought of Easter lily. And I actually had my, I don't remember, I was just gently touching her on her shoulder or whatever. And I pictured the Easter lily in my mind. And I tried to tune into the energy of the Easter lily. And within 5 seconds of doing that, she uncurled and was out of pain. It was the energy of that plant. Its spirit, its personality, its whatever, not its physical form. And I remember hearing that Native Americans said, if you approach the plants with reverence, they'll heal your soul, not just your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely believe that's true. And so I've seen amazing changes in people using just flower remedies and stuff like that. But that was a time when I didn't have the flower remedy. I just called on the spirit of that plant to come help me. And it was just almost like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The few flower essences that I have worked with, one of them was beech, the beech tree. And, within weeks, you start to get these experiences with this essence, and it's already kind of blowing your mind of like, oh my gosh, how is this, how is it working? And then, and as well as kind of releasing into the mystery of it, which is a big part of, I think, my practice right now, is allowing that mystery and just knowing that they do work like that. And I don't have to try and figure it out. I can have fun while doing that and trying to figure some things out. But at the end of the day, it also is meant to be a mystery. But with beech, eventually, it was, if I just call to it in my mind or call to it in prayer, and it'll start to just show whatever needs to be shown in that moment, and I've had some wonderful experiences with that essence. I don't work a lot with flower essences these days, but that, like you said, it's a whole nother component of plants. And and even a regular plant tincture is going to work at that level as well. Yep. But if you just want to work with an essence for a specific thing, then you have that option as well on the mental, emotional body.
Yeah. Well, I think if you take a tincture of the plant and just use it in small 1 or 2 drop doses, it acts very much like the flower essence does in terms of the energetics. I had another thing. I was feeling really trapped. Like I was in a situation that I didn't know how to get myself out of, and it was making me depressed. And I remember Matthew Wood, who I really, really love Matthew Wood, so I was glad you mentioned him, and him talking about black cohosh for people when you feel like you're trapped and wrestling in darkness. So I started taking black cohosh flower essence, and within 2 days, it was like a light bulb came on. And I saw I was only trapped because I was unwilling to really look at all my options. And I immediately opened up to me that there were ways of resolving this problem, and I just needed to act on them. And it lifted me out of the depression. So that's why I say, to me, it's amazing that the plants can actually help you on that level too. That they're not just helping with physical illness, they can help you when you're struggling mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Like that's why I like Matthew's book, 7 Herbs, Plants as Teachers, because I think plants can become teachers for us when we allow them to be. Yeah. Anyway, I probably need to look at wrapping this up because I've got some other things for the rest of the day. But I have absolutely thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. This has been a lot of fun.
Same. We'll have to get back together. What do you think in a month or two, and we'll actually do antibiotics?
Yeah, and talk about.
Yeah, I mean, this has gone exactly how I would prefer it to go. Instead of, it's to me, it's you can have one topic, but it's way more fun for it to be a conversation like this. But I would
Yeah.
be more than happy to get back on and we can kind of go through antibiotics a little bit more focused at some point if you
Well,
like.
talk about, how to work with an infection
Yeah,
from a holistic point of view rather than just trying to kill the germs.
yeah. Let's
Yeah.
let's do that. Well, I'll be in touch, and then we can figure that one out in the near future.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Again, we delved into some pretty deep topics, I think. So that was, but it was good. All right.
For
Okay.
sure. All right.
All
Thank
right.
you, Stephen.
You're welcome. Okay. Bye.
Bye.